There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel and another Friday Reads. And this is... God, was I complaining? I don't think I was complaining. Was I complaining when I said we didn't have any snow and it wasn't very cold? Whew, this has been a really cold week. Right now, the temperature at 10 o'clock, I think, on Friday morning, 10:30 maybe, is minus 37 Celsius with a wind chill bringing it down to minus 49. So how's the weather where you are? Jesus. I haven't been out of the house for 5, 6 days, 7 days. I can't remember when I was last out. Thank God for grocery delivery and whatnot, but staying warm inside. I don't have any personal news this week, but I do want to do something I haven't done for a long time. I don't have much time for BookTube watching in my busy BookTube creator life, but thankfully I have other people that point me towards things I must watch. So my dear friend Joe Smith pointed me toward a brand new booktuber, a brand new pair of booktubers that I am delighted to shout out with all my heart, because these two are just amazing. They've only got 2 videos up at the time that I'm recording this, and I'm going to play, as I always do, a minute or two of their video while I'm talking. If you're anything like me, you're going to subscribe just on the basis of what they look like, how animated they are, but you want to turn the volume up, of course, when you check them. The channel name is And They Were Readers, and the hosts are John and Sierra. And they are, as far as I can understand it from what they've said, they are not a couple, they are a couple of friends who both secretly got into reading during the pandemic, I believe, and then came out to each other as readers and have been talking about nothing but books ever since, and talking for a long time about starting up a channel, and I'm so delighted they have. The energy between them is just electrifying. They're so funny, and you can learn lots of adjacent things, like how to hold a teacup. Just, they read mostly literary fiction. They're wanting to branch out. I hope they don't branch out too much, because I'm really enjoying the books they talk about too. And I want to give them an extremely warm welcome to BookTube, and I want you to go subscribe, because they are the bee's knees. All right, from one exciting thing to another, here is this week's mystery guest. I'm delighted to welcome as this week's mystery guest, the Alberta writer, Betty Jane Hegerat, joining us from Calgary. Hello, Betty Jane.
Hello, Sean.
How wonderful to finally meet you. We kind of met, if that's the right word. We kind of got in contact through Barb Howard, who's been on my channel several times. And Barb is a friend of yours and is becoming a bookish friend of mine. Betty Jane Hegerat, most recently, one of her most recent publications is this short story collection, Crack in the Wall. And I actually featured one of her stories on my Patreon back in the day when I was reading stories to my patrons. Those days are done, but Pins and Needles, it's a wonderful story. And so it's very exciting to be here chatting books with you today, Betty Jane. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thanks. And I will just make a slight correction and say that this is not one of my recent books, actually. Crack in the Wall was my second book. And it was published quite some time back.
Thank you.
And I'm glad you've enjoyed the stories, and I certainly enjoyed your reading of Pins and Needles.
I'm going to read them all and have you back to have a longer chat about this. It was published in 2008, I now see.
Mm-hmm.
You were talking about boxes of books you got from your son and all the things you're reading. So please, can you repeat some of that? It was so interesting.
Absolutely. I mentioned that I am on a jury for a book award, and I mentioned too that that's all I can say about that pile of books. But my son, who is moving, came home at Christmas time with 2 enormous boxes of books because he was culling his books. And as it turns out, and I knew well in advance, these are mainly books that I have given him as gifts over the years. And they are all favorites of mine. This young man has very good taste, literary taste. He and I like the same books. And so I've been diving into these books and finding books that I'd forgotten and had loved. And I was, I guess, not amazed, but I was sort of overwhelmed by finding 6 collections of stories by Alice Munro. And so I have been dipping back into those stories and having a wonderful time because I read them long ago, and many of them I remember very, very well. And it would be interesting for me to speculate on why those stuck. And others, I think, have a vague memory, but it's still really interesting. And I think what I'm most interested in now is that even though I know where she went with the book, is paying really close attention to how she got there, because she's an absolute magician. She's brilliant, right?
Absolutely. I have read many, I would say most of her short story collections, not all. And I don't think I've ever reread one. And I think I really must. Yeah, they would repay rereading. I'm sure that's true.
There's so many
Do you have
books.
so many books? Do you have a favorite Alice Munro collection?
I think that one of the very early ones was probably my favorite. It was Lives of Girls and Women. That I remember, and that's one I will pluck off the shelf one day when I can dig through my own books and reread, and to see if it still holds that status in my
Right.
my Alice Munro collection.
I'm sure it will. I think, oh goodness, I've loved them all, but I think one that stands out, maybe the first one that spoke to me deeply, I would call my favorite, and that's Open Secret. That's great. In the 90s, I think that came out.
Oh yeah, yeah.
You're working on some more short stories.
I am. I took a bit of time off from my writing. I had a novel, then a collection of short stories, then another novel, and then I had a book, a very strange book, actually. People have had a hard time classifying it as creative nonfiction. It's a strange braid of investigative journalism about a long ago crime, a grisly murder in central Alberta. It's called The Boy and was published by Ulican Books in Fernie. I've written a fictional story that kind of parallels that story, how I came to do that. I started out writing the fiction, actually, and then this memory sort of clicked in of the real murders. And so I began to write, working on both of them. And interestingly, I have a couple of mentors who gave me very stern advice. Dave Margocius, who is a dear friend and mentor of mine who lives in Saskatoon, said, "Stay away from the investigative journalist. You are not a journalist. You write fiction. Write the fiction." Then I went to UBC to work on the novel because I really desperately felt I needed help. And so I did an MFA in creative writing and worked with Terry Glavin, who is a journalist. And Glavin said, "Get that fiction out of here." He said, "Don't mess up that." He said, "Truth matters, Betty Jane." And that's, I came away from his course and from his mentorship with this emblazoned on my brain. And so I thought about it a lot, and I thought, darn it, you guys aren't going to tell me what to do. I'm writing both, and I'm going to see how they fit together. So there's also memoir, and there's about me remembering the crimes, and there's also a thread that talks about the writing of the book, metafiction. So I came out of that in a kind of a dark place, and I thought I took quite a bit of time off, and then finally thought I'm going to dig through old short stories, see what I have, some published in literary magazines, some not published and in need of finishing or not. A lot of them just kind of went into the delete pile. But I did finally put together a collection, and I worked with a very fine editor in Edmonton, Peter Midgley. Interestingly, when I approached Peter about looking at the collection, I said, "Now, I know that this short stories are a very hard sell. And I also know, and I think it's darn well about time, that stories being written by marginalized writers are finally coming to the forefront, that people who were not telling their stories before are being spotlighted and they are telling their stories. And I have no difficulty with those stories rising to the top of the pile at all." So I said, I don't know. I'm an old white woman writing stories basically about other suburbia. What do you think? Is there any market? Is any laugh? And said, "Betty Jane, I know you're writing, and I think that you can probably carry on this collection." So I have done. It's out there looking for a home.
It's out there looking for a home. So any publishers watching me, please take note. And there's room for all the voices. Well, this is exciting. So yeah, we need to get that short story collection out in the world. Does it have and you may not want to reveal it if it does, but does it have a working title, the collection?
It does. And, it's an interesting for me. Well, I guess it's not for me because I don't tend to write linked short stories. And I'm always looking for a theme. I think one of the reasons it took me so long to finally put together another book was I couldn't find a theme for these stories because they're told by narrators ranging from a 9-year-old boy to an 80-year-old woman. I have men and women and people in between. There isn't kind of a consistency to the characters or to the stories. But when I showed the book to this person who was helping me do the editing, he said there is definitely a theme, and it is the elephant in the room. Because in almost every story, there is someone or something critical to this story that's hanging there, and we can see a shadow, but it's not there. This person is not there. Person is gone, or this person is off somewhere. And the last story in the book is actually called Elephants, and that was really where the title came from. But it is called at the moment An Elephant in the Room, but of course publishers, if I'm lucky enough to find one, have the last say on cover art and titles. And so let's see.
And you're a big reader, so what have you been reading recently that you'd like to recommend or talk about?
Well, one of the most powerful books, and one I've been talking about ever since I read it, is Sarah Polley's book, Run Towards the Danger.
Oh, yes.
And this is an absolutely brilliant book of essays. She talks about her life, which makes me shake my head and wonder how she survived all that she did. A child actor doing Road to Avonlea. She would have a terrible scoliosis, was in a body brace doing that in horrible pain. It goes through the period of her life up until now, and she talks about so very many difficulties. And I just found it brilliant. The writing is brilliant, of course, because we know about Sarah Polley, and we know that she's an amazing actor, a director, a writer. But I was truly more moved and more engaged with this book than I have been at something with a very, very.
I've heard so much praise for that book, so it's on my list. And for non-Canadians that don't know, Sarah Polley is an actor, a director, a writer. Well, have I missed anything?
No, don't think so.
Yeah, and this memoir has just really taken off.
Another one that I've read recently, and this is because I love short story, and because I have known a number of writers who come out of the Mennonite culture who are brilliant storytellers. They're also wonderful singers, so many of these people. But the storytelling, David Bergen is one of my favorite writers. And David Bergen has won and has been shortlisted for the Giller Prize a number of times. But I missed this latest book of short stories, which was called Hear the Dark and was published in 2020. But I am absolutely loving it because it takes us to Vietnam in one story, to Honduras, to the Canadian prairies. There is a novella included in the book, which both you and Barb would probably love. It's about a young Mennonite woman struggling with her identity in the world beyond this community that she's lived in. And it's gorgeous writing, absolutely gorgeous writing.
I guess he must be a bit of a Marmite writer because I have a good reading friend who just didn't get along with that book at all.
Oh, really?
I haven't read anything he's written, but.
Okay, well, that's interesting. And,
Yeah.
the other one of his books that I think actually did win the Giller, Away from the Dead, was a brilliant book as well. But, we all come at books with different perceptions, different experience, biases, whatever. I've been in so many book discussion groups myself, and I've been to book clubs. I've been a guest at book clubs when people are talking about my books. And I always find it interesting because there will inevitably be someone who's very quiet and who I sense simply did not like the book. And I've had some interesting experiences with that. In one of my books, there is a character and somebody asked me, is there a character in this book that is a lot like you? Do you put yourself in story? I said, well, I don't put myself in story, but the one character in the book is the foster mother. This is my first book, Running Toward Home. And I said, she's probably a lot like me. And immediately someone piped up and said, I couldn't stand that woman. She whines. I just sort of said, you probably shouldn't read any of my stories for writing because I think I'm there. Book clubs are wonderful fun. Yeah.
They're wonderful, and there's often those kind of situations can arise. Yes,
Absolutely.
I could share stories till the cows come home. Being a member.
And because I'm reading all of these books for an award, and because I have this big box of my son's books that's come in, I find myself reading the first pile of books, but then every now and again dipping into Eric's books and reading some of them. And one that I found in that pile is a book by Raymond Carver, and it's called What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. And I love Carver's stories. They are so brilliantly contained, so tight, and so terse. You can't find an extra word anywhere in these stories. It's not new by any shot. It's a book published many years ago, but I absolutely love it. And I love it too because another friend and mentor, David Carpenter, has written about what we talk about when we talk about Raymond Carver, and it's about duck hunting with Raymond Carver when he was a guest author in Saskatchewan. So I've been reading Carver. Also in Eric's pile of books is a book by another very good friend and mentor of mine, Dave Margocius. And it's a book that has the absolutely audacious title, and he says it is audacious, of A Book of Great Worth. And he said he wasn't sure whether his publisher would want to keep that title, but it is the title of one of the stories and one of the finest stories in the book. Now, Dave has told me that he feels that he gets kind of pegged as a regional writer, a prairie writer, and he's not at all. He grew up in New Jersey, and this book is stories really about his father during the 20s and 30s in the Lower East Side of New York City. He was a journalist, Jewish. They're gorgeous, gorgeous stories, but it got had very little traction, and that absolutely amazed me. So for that very reason, I'm giving it a shout out right now.
That's wonderful. People describe him as kind of Western Canada's best kept literary secret. Like he should be much more well known than he is.
Oh, goodness, yes. And there are so many books that just kind of go to grass, as it were. They're published and they come out, and then they're over there. And so I quite often will go through books that I've read and I think need mention. And on my website, I occasionally will publish a list of books that I think went to sleep far too soon.
Do you have other favorite short story writers that you haven't mentioned already today?
Oh, there are a number of local writers who are wonderful short story writers. Barb Howard. I don't know whether you've read her short stories.
I've only read one for the same reason I read yours for my Patreon. Yeah, and I'm looking forward to reading more.
Wonderful book called Western Taxidermy. Another local writer that Barb may have mentioned to you, Lee Cavern, is a wonderful short story writer, and has a book of short stories called 7 Ways to Sunday.
Oh,
and
great title.
It's a wonderful, wonderful book. Lee is a stylist. It's interesting. There are a group of writers that I give my own work to. We share work, and Barb is one of them, and Lee is one of them, and there are a couple of others. And without even looking at the names at the top of the critiques that come back to me, I can tell where they're coming from. Because there will be one who says, well, Betty, I think the story starts, and she's paging, and she says, I think it starts here on page 10. And I think, it takes that long to get into it. Another will say, I need to know more. And I like to write kind of tight stories, compact stories. And I always think, well, you know what? I operate like the KGB with a need to know kind of policy. So you're not going to get to know more about that.
Oh, well, I can tell we're going to have a rousing discussion once I've read more of your work, because you've certainly got me intrigued to do a deep dive on the oeuvre of Betty Jane Hegerat. Such a great chat, Betty Jane. I hope you'll come back.
Well, Sean, I so appreciate what you're doing in bringing these books to the fore, reading all of these books. My goodness, I'm amazed at the number of books you've read and written about. And so I thank you for that.
Well, it's my pleasure. And yes, I think you and I both live and breathe books. I had been emailing back and forth with Betty Jane for a year or more. It was delightful to finally meet her that way. And I'm looking forward to reading her books. Her book, The Boy, sounds really intriguing. I think that's the one I'm gonna read first. I have some Patreon announcements just about upcoming things. As a reminder for people who are already my patrons or for people that are toying with the idea of becoming my patrons, here's a couple things that are coming up. One is tomorrow. There is a bookish brunch. We have these monthly, and we just meet on Zoom and talk. I don't talk, I just listen. My patrons share with each other what they've been reading. There's a bookish brunch tomorrow, so if you join really quickly, I think it's at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time, tomorrow, Saturday, and they're a lot of fun. And the first read-along of 2024, for patrons at the mid and upper tier, that's the Story Seeker and Bibliophile Bestie tiers, we're starting a read-along of Somerset Maugham's Of Human Bondage, which, if you don't know, is just a doorstopper of a novel. So we're splitting it up into 2 check-ins. Hopefully it's going to be a recorded Zoom chat, not for my main channel here, but just on Patreon. So the first half, we're going to check in the middle of March, and the second half at the end of April. To you know how much of a slow reader I am, so I'm making my patrons conform to my reading style. And so that's coming up. All right, here is the week in review.
I think, all of us who participate in social media in some form or try to influence others about what to read and what's good literature and whatnot, always, at least I'm self-aware of the fact, I don't want to seem as overbearing or snobby or overly snarky. I know it can happen sometimes. You're always self-conscious of that. So I really appreciated an attempt to reframe how we talk to others about books.
This was one of the books on the curriculum, and it's Percy James's House of Hate. The title really sums up what it's about.
Wow.
It's about a Newfoundland family. I can't remember if Corner Brook, which is now a city but would have been back then a town, was identified by name in the book, but is definitely pointed out by the cover. And because it's semi-autobiographical, we know that Percy James grew up a lot in Corner Brook, Newfoundland.
The tendency to assume I've no privacy has persisted despite my best efforts, but I am determined to break it. This journal does not deserve to have a foul black mark running through every incriminating thought. I will no longer censor myself. I digress. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm totally hooked. I want to keep reading, so... I shared thoughts about a friend reading historical smut, and I think that would be kind of a guilty pleasure if you like it. Why not? But that she keeps that on a private list. She doesn't put it on Goodreads.
Yeah.
So what kind of smut do you withhold from all of us, Elizabeth?
Well, I suppose the same historical smut. I like a good romance, a good bodice ripper once in a while.
Okay, this week I have finished 2 books, and I have maybe 3, I'm not sure, 3 or 4 to check in on. Stuff I've started that I didn't even tell you I was going to start and whatnot. So let's get at it. I finished Night by Edna O'Brien. I told you last week I didn't like it, and I still didn't like it. I think I liked the second half a little bit better, mostly listening to my buddy reader, Sonia, of An Enthusiastic Reader, because she got so much more out of it. She didn't love it, but she liked it, and I didn't like it. But listening to her, there were some poignant parts to do with the woman's son, but I just never could get into this. Like, I just didn't ever really care or get invested, other than appreciating the language. It was, I would say, basically a dud for me. But check out Sonia's channel. Eventually, she's probably going to talk about it there, and she appreciated more things about it than I did. It was the most disappointing of anything I've read by Edna O'Brien, for me personally. 3 stars. Couldn't give it any less than 3 stars because the writing was gorgeous, as always. And I have finally finished. I started reading this novel in July. Now, I wasn't reading it continuously since July. It's a 300-page novel, but I put it down for months at a time, not because I wasn't enjoying it, but just because of, the way that I read or don't read all the books I'm supposedly reading. So I finished this in a great big gulp in the last couple of weeks. Mavis Cheek's The Sex Life of My Aunt. And this was one of the books that was on my I have to read these books in 2023 or unhaul them video at the beginning of last year. And this is one that carried over into early 2024, but I enjoyed it. I'm glad I read it. Didn't love it, but I quite liked it. It was published in 2002. Mavis Cheek died last year. This would be a book. It's got a 3.6 rating or something like that on Goodreads, and I can see it wouldn't appeal to many of a reader. If you can't really stomach a novel about adultery, that's really the overarching theme of this novel. And I don't really love reading about adultery, but I thought that she did a good job with a difficult theme. And I wasn't turned off other than in a few places where I thought, this part could be a little bit shorter. I think I get it. But she was torn between two lovers. She loved her husband, but she loved her younger lover that she met by chance when she was in a very emotional state coming back from one of her best friend's funeral. And a love affair started, and that's often what happens when people are grieving. I can attest to that, but I'm not going to attest to that right here and right now. But it was believable. I thought that the characters were really quite well-rounded. There was a lot of humor, and there was a lot of insight. Like one of the Goodreads reviews that I liked about this said that it sounds like it could be a really superficial novel, but Mavis Cheek really delves, and I thought that was the perfect verb. And what I especially appreciated about it was the story that she was giving her husband, who she loved very much, but, it was kind of a sexless marriage, or it was kind of a little bit stale, but she still loved him. And then she had this 10-year younger man on the side who was 40, so they would be in their 50s, I guess, that was really lighting her fire. And I mean, this is a universal problem in conjugal life, how to keep the sexual side of things going after a certain amount of time together. Very relatable. Oh, and I was starting to say, early on in the affair, she kept using her aunt that her husband Francis had never met as an excuse. Oh, my aunt needs me. I have to go over right now, when in fact she was sneaking out to a motel with her lover. And then near the end, what she does with that becomes, instead of just being a plot device, we actually meet the aunt and get her story. And I thought that made the novel almost profound. Not quite for me, but I really appreciated it. It made me wonder if this is her best novel, or if there's others where she might have delved down to that level of profundity. Because I enjoyed this. So a theme that doesn't usually interest me, but the writing was great, and I appreciated and responded to all that delving. I have started an audiobook. I got stalled with audiobooks in 2023 because basically I was going to say I was too lazy, but there was extenuating circumstances. I was pretty sick for much of the year, and I stopped going to the gym. And when I go to the gym, I always listen to audiobooks, and the gym's just a little gym with a treadmill downstairs, and it's really great because otherwise I sit on the chair all day and read and sleep, and that's all I do. But it's really good to go down. I just go down for 10 minutes at a time, but at least 3 times a day. And so I started back after, 6, 8, 10 months. I have no idea when I stopped, but I'm back, and so I needed an audiobook. I have audiobooks that aren't finished, but I can't get them to play on my old iPhone, so I was restricted to whatever I could get from Libby. So I started one that Lara, who you saw on the Newfoundland Lit Chat, one of her last appearances on, I think it was her last appearance on Bite Size Book Chat, she recommended this, and I could get both the ebook and the audiobook from Libby, and so I am 20 or 25% of the way into that. It's called This Is How We Love by the Newfoundland writer Lisa Moore. And I'm enjoying it. It opens with a bang. The mother and father are having a holiday, I think they're in Mexico or something. And they get a call that their 21-year-old son has been viciously attacked and is in hospital in emergency, in critical condition. Probably will survive, but maybe not. And so the mother rushes back alone. The father's coming soon. And then from there, we get the mother's perspective on all the family background of her and her husband, and also a childhood friend of her son Xavier's that seems like she's going to be more and more instrumental in the plot, although I don't know. Writing is great. I think it's read by the author. Anyway, it's got lovely Newfoundlander accent. I'm enjoying it. I don't know if there's much more to it. There isn't yet. But what there is a really complicated web of step families and foster families, and she is painting a picture of how family can be a complex web that, even though it may not look like the families you see on sitcoms on TV, creates essential connections that keep us going. I don't know how to finish that sentence, but it's all about family, and I'm not sure if there's going to be more to it than that, but I'm enjoying it for what it is for now. Speaking of families, this is a novel about how fucked up families can be. This is the deaf horror novel Apparitions by Adam Pottle, and I'm doing this as a buddy read with Heidi. I don't read horror. So far, what I've read, I wouldn't characterize as horror, but what the hell do I know? Adam Pottle is a deaf writer and academic professor here in Saskatoon, who Heidi and I read his memoir called Voice last fall, and we're quite taken with it. And I went to the book launch for this, and I'm going to interview Adam Pottle once I'm finished reading this. But this is about a deaf teenager who escapes from his father. His father basically kidnapped him from his mother. They were separated or divorced or whatever. And the father kind of took him away from the mother just to be mean, and then locked him in a room in the basement with no windows and just, no toilet facilities, just treated him worse than an animal would be treated. And he escapes from there, and that's where I'm at. He's in a mental health institution. The first person voice is incredibly compelling. There's a lot of tough stuff. I wouldn't describe it as gory, but there's certainly lots of violence, and he has been, with the absence of any parenting, he's kind of feral at this point. Wild. The writing is just so gorgeous. Now, Heidi had a few problems with it that I didn't. I don't like horror, so it's not going to probably be my favorite book of the year, but I am blown away by the prose. And the story is definitely holding my interest. It's very disturbing to read a story of such abuse, and apparently it's based on several well-known true stories about parents that did this to their deaf kids. And that's really all I can say about it. It certainly goes with my new blouse, and I'm looking forward to... Well, I say I'm looking forward to continuing. I'm not really, because it's an awful story, but it is gorgeously written. And this is the latest novel by one of my favorite writers, Anukrti Upadhyay, Kintsugi, which I mispronounced last week because I thought that was an E. I don't know why I thought it was an E, and I thought, why did they misspell it? Well, when I look at it, it kind of looks like a... Anyway, because the word is Kintsugi, which is about the repairing broken dishes. And there's a whole philosophy about it, which has already been explored to a certain extent in the first quarter. Actually, I think Joe Smith and I are buddy reading it, and I think we've already read about 40%. And it's really good. It has... I think it's going to be a collection of stories about characters that are interlinked. So the first story, I mean, I don't think they're not meant to be standalone stories, but they're sections, I guess, of a larger novel. And in the first section, we meet Haruko, and she is a young Japanese woman with considerable talent, artistic talent, especially jewelry making, and she gets apprenticed to a world-renowned jewelry maker in Jaipur in Rajasthan. And the jewelry maker guru guy takes her on as an apprentice, recommended by an American client or customer of his, without realizing that it's not a man. And she shows up, and it's a Japanese woman, and they train her, and she is incredibly talented. And I found reading about the jewelry making process and the descriptions of the kind of jewelry that comes from this city, Jaipur. Am I pronouncing it right? Jaipur. I've just checked. It's pronounced Jaipur, I think. It's really, really interesting. There was a love story in the first section that I wasn't as sure about. And then in the second section, we meet an Indian girl from the same town, Jaipur in India, who is at university in Tokyo. And she she forms a friendship with a Japanese woman, and it's that story. And that's as far as we've got. So I know that we're going to get Haruko's Indian doctor boyfriend story is coming up later, and so is another of the characters from India. So I'm not sure how it's all going to fit together. certainly holding my interest, and we'll just carry on. And finally, I started this novel that was translated into English by my former prof, David Carpenter, who I've been doing a series of interviews with, and I'm going to be doing a full-length interview with him about this. This was his first published work, and it was a translation. It is called The Forest by Georges Bugnet, and if you watch the full-length video, the first one that's up, he talks about his connection, his relationship with Georges Bugnet, and it's fascinating. I'll put a link to that in the show notes because you must watch it. And like I say, that's what made me want to read this book. I've ordered my own copy from the bookstore, but it hasn't come in yet, so I got the library copy, and I'm reading it to my dear friend Mary Jean. And eventually, when I'm done, I'll have a chat with Dave about it. It was originally published in French in 1935, and the translation is 1976. And when it was 1976, Georges Bugnet was still alive and kicking, and he would have been 97. I think he lived into his early 100s. And I'm enjoying it. It's about homesteaders. They're French from France, not from Quebec. They're French from France who end up homesteading in Alberta, near a forest. And the story's just getting started, so I don't have much to say other than that I'm enjoying it. One of the reasons that David Carpenter was so interested in it is because it was one of the first works of Western Canadian literature where a male writer wrote in a female voice. It's not exclusively in a female voice, but we do dip into the, or maybe what he said is that where it was done successfully, where the woman was full-bodied, because a lot of David Carpenter's literary criticism of Western Canadian literature was how awful the men wrote women in their fiction, and this was one of the early ones that did it well. So I would agree with that now that I'm on page 29, and we'll just carry on. So that's quite an assortment of books. Welcome to my world. I'm only going to start one, and it's from the library, so I want to get started with it. I'm going to try to use the library a lot more this year, especially for new books. Not buy a bunch of new books that I don't know if I'm going to like. I'll only buy them if I absolutely love them and need them on my shelf after I've read them. I knew about this book before, but then I found out that Greg of Supposedly Fun had read it and quite liked it. And that was enough for me. I didn't watch the full comments he made on it because I didn't want to know more than that until I've read it, but here I've got it. Susie Boyt's Loved and Missed, an NYRB book published in 2021. It appears to be about a mother and a daughter and her adult daughter who is addicted, who has addiction issues, and that is all I need to know before I jump in. And that's it. Thanks for watching.